Good evening. Police in Munich have confirmed that a 24-year-old Afghan asylum seeker drove into a group attending a trade union rally, injuring at least 28 people. Officers are treating the incident as a suspected attack. Well, it comes as the city readies itself for tomorrow's Munich Security Conference, where a wide range of global figures will meet, including US Vice President JD Vance and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A-News's Trent Murray is in Munich for us and at the scene of the incident. Trent, what's the latest where you are?
Well, Guy, you can probably see behind me there the aftermath of this incident. That Mini Cooper there sustaining very heavy damage after the driver ploughed into a crowd of 1,000 people. Now, at around 10:30 a.m. local time here on this street, there was a major union rally underway. Workers from across the city at places like hospitals and public facilities had walked off the job as part of a citywide strike. And it was when they were marching up this street that this driver, according to eyewitnesses, accelerated towards them. We have seen police here going through the forensic. There is a lot of damage there. We can see a children's pram. We understand one of the injuries of the 27 injuries is a small child. Right now, we know that those injured, including those ones that are critically, have been taken to nearby hospitals, and the investigation is now underway. But it certainly is a desperately sad scene here in the Bavarian capital. As I say, 1,000 people here on the street when that driver accelerated rapidly towards them.
Trent, this has obviously happened while world leaders are landing in the city for tomorrow's big event. Is there any suggestion of the incident being related in any way?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's already a huge police presence here in the city because of the Munich Security Conference, and that is because you've got the likes of US Vice President JD Vance here and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Now, there's no suggestion right now that this incident is necessarily related to that. We heard earlier from the Bavarian First Minister, effectively the governor of this state. He is saying that this is indeed a suspected attack, and it is thought that the driver was a 24-year-old asylum seeker from Afghanistan. He was known to police for issues relating to theft and drug use. That will obviously now form part of the investigation, but certainly the suggestion from authorities here is that it was a deliberate act. The eyewitnesses say he accelerated rapidly towards that crowd, and of course, as you rightly say, this incident comes as all of these world leaders arrive for this major summit. You would imagine that they will be now stepping up security even more than they were planning to.
Trent, thank you. Trent Murray for us there in Munich. Well, JD Vance, the US Vice President, is expected to speak at the Munich Security Conference tomorrow and meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's get more on this now from Obey Sharbanda in Washington. Obey, thanks very much for joining us. Now, this meeting and the speech by Vice President Vance, they're very much anticipated, aren't they? What do we know about what he's likely to say?
Yeah, of course, Vice President JD Vance is going to give a major speech at the Munich Security Conference on Friday. Of course, it'll largely center on the ongoing war in Ukraine, and that speech will come on the backs of the phone call that President Trump held yesterday with President Vladimir Putin, where, according to the readout that President Trump gave on social media, that the two agreed to begin negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. And some of what the vice president is expected to talk about, we have a sort of a sense of the general themes, judging from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was just in Brussels earlier this week, meeting with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group of other European allies, NATO member states, who are providing military support and weapons to Ukraine. And in that speech that he gave to Western allies, Secretary of Defense Hegseth said that there are new stark strategic realities that entail that Europe must do more for its own defense. And of course, that has been a general theme that we've heard from President Trump time and time again that there needs to be security for the American financial support to Ukraine that will come more than likely in the form of rare earth mineral rights that Ukraine has being negotiated with the U.S. So that is another theme that will likely arise in J.D. Vance's speech, that Europe needs to do more to not only in support of Ukraine, but that stark strategic realities for the U.S. means that there are only so many anti-aircraft missiles, so many artillery shells that the U.S. can produce, and they can't all be transferred to Ukraine because the U.S. also has other theaters of operation around the world, primarily the Pacific, with China being a rising competitor with the U.S. and U.S. military needing to prepare for potential scenarios that would arise in the Pacific. And so hence, the Trump administration wants to see European allies to do more, to step up in terms of not only paying more for their own defense, but exceeding the American aid going to Ukraine. So those were previous statements and themes that we've heard from President Trump and from the Secretary of Defense earlier this week that will likely come up in J.D. Vance's speech. And of course, J.D. Vance was in Munich Security Conference last year, where he directly brought up the fact that the U.S. can only produce so many Patriot air defense missiles and artillery shells, and that the U.S. has other priorities around the world. It can't just only be Ukraine. And of course, the Secretary of Defense earlier this week, reflecting President Trump's desire for NATO member states to pay upwards of 5% of their GDP for their defense. That's more than the current standard of 2% of the GDP. And so I think the vice president will really hone in on that theme of that, hey, Europe needs to pay more and that America needs to have some sort of return for the hundreds of billions of dollars that it has provided Ukraine in its ongoing war. And we will also, given President Trump's phone call with President Putin of Russia, also hear a reiteration of the desire for the U.S. to play a leading role in brokering an end to this war that, according to Western estimates, has killed upwards of 800,000 Russian soldiers who have been killed or wounded, and around 600,000 Ukrainian military casualties.
Now, Obey, J.D. Vance has been in Paris. He's now in Munich. He's part of an administration that's proudly America first, but he seems to be engaging far and wide with European actors. What's the overarching US game plan here?
Well, what the Trump administration has said is that America first is not America alone. I mean, we heard from Secretary of Defense Hegseth when he met the new NATO Secretary General Rutte, thanking NATO for its role in defending the European continent. So certainly we've seen from senior Trump administration officials that they are not opposed to international alliances that the U.S. is currently part of. Of course, the U.S. provides by far the largest amount of military support to NATO. It has the largest army in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I think the message here coming from the Trump administration is that the U.S. is doing a lot more than Europe to defend Europe. And you have Germany, for example, European economies like Germany, the largest economy in Europe, that have the capacity to fund more of Europe's defense in the NATO military alliance. And that, we heard President Trump likes to say that, hey, the U.S. is protected by two great oceans, and yet the war in Europe is happening in the backyard of major NATO member states like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. But why is the U.S. spending more for that war than those countries? But it does not necessarily entail that the U.S. wants to withdraw from those military alliances. It's just a recalibration. So I think you're going to hear a tough message from J.D. Vance, trying to put pressure on longtime allies, but at the same time reiterating that the U.S. remains committed to these security partnerships, but the U.S. also has other goals, including defending the homeland and border security and countering cartels that have now been designated as terror groups, so that Ukraine and the European theater of operations cannot be the sole focus of the U.S. defense establishment and the American military.
Obey Shambada. Very, very interesting stuff. Thank you, as always, Obey, for us there in Washington, D.C. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of Newshour. Please stay with us for more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a pleasant evening ahead.